Hello, good afternoon. I am Chiqui Cartagena, the CMO of the Conference Board and the leader of the Marketing and Communications Center. Today we'll be sharing with you insights from the Harris Poll, and the data you will see comes from a number of different studies Harris has been conducting, some of them for over 20 years, and others like the COVID-19 weekly tracker since the beginning of the pandemic in March. All the data you will see here today was custom curated for you, our Conference Board audience, so you're in for a real treat, one that I hope we can bring to you every month. But before we get started, I want to remind everybody that CPE credit is available for this webcast. If you would like to earn credit, make sure to provide us with your name and email in the designated box below, and click on the 3 pop-ups that will appear on screen throughout the program. You must be on the program for the entire duration in order to get credit. So let's get started. To begin, I'd like to introduce our guest today. And I want to start with Rob Yekyelek. Sorry, Rob. How do you pronounce your name?
Yekyelek.
Yekyelek. There you go.
Perfect.
He's the managing director of Harris Poll, and Rob has over 18 years of experience leading the development of transformational brand and reputation programs, working as an advisor to senior executives at some of the world's largest and most influential organizations. Also joining me today is my colleague, Craig Carroll, who runs our Communication Institute here at the Conference Board and is the executive director of the Observatory on Corporate Reputation, or better known as the OCR network. Craig has published 3 of the leading research compendiums on corporate reputation, and he also teaches graduate courses in corporate communications, reputation, and social responsibility in programs around the world. Craig, I don't know how you do it. Welcome to you both.
Well, right now in COVID-19 I'm not, but thank you.
Rob, I want to get to your presentation sooner than later because I know you have a lot of great data to share with us today. And basically we're going to be talking about how people feel about the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also going to be discussing what companies have gotten positive bumps in reputation during these past 6 months, right? And I'm sure Craig and I will want to ask you some questions as we go along. Of course, you, our audience, are also welcome to ask questions, and to do that, you use the little chat function on the bottom of your screen, and I will be monitoring, Craig will be looking for your questions that we can ask Rob directly. So we want this to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to jump in and ask a question if you see a piece of data from a slide that you want to delve deeper in. And by the way, to see the slides better, please make sure you click on the Make Full Screen icon on the top right-hand corner of your screen, the one with the 4 arrows pointing out, and like that you'll be able to see this beautiful deck that Rob has put together for us today. So with that, Rob, let's get started with all this great data you've put together. Welcome.
Right. Thank you so much, Chiqui. Thank you, Craig. Wonderful to be here and to join the Conference Board community for our discussion today. So just as a kind of a quick starting point, many of you have probably heard the Harris Poll name, and many of you have probably run into our research in the press. So just the quick background, we've been around for the last 50 years and really kind of a leading data-driven voice on many trends across business, politics, and society. And in particular, that's relevant for today's discussion, we have a center of excellence very deep in the reputational space, which is a key thing that we'll be sharing with you today. Again, this idea of reputation has morphed over time. A lot of our work is currently with some of the leading purpose and sustainability organizations.
Hey, Rob, we're losing your audio. You might want to try to speak louder or go to the, as we were doing at the beginning, pump up your mic volume.
Okay. I just increased my microphone volume. Is that better?
Much better. I hear you much better. Barbara, can you hear him better? Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Please stop me if anything breaks like that. So as I was just saying, a big part of the conversation today is looking at reputation, but really in context of the intersection between reputation, social issues, and increasingly purpose and sustainability. We work all those areas are ones that we work very deeply in with organizations like Just Capital, Ethisphere, as well as Brands for Good. And again, more importantly than anything, we're going to get into the research versus just talking about it. So,
great. So let's get started.
Perfect. So today's conversation really is around reputation and purpose. And with all of our conversations, we like to set it in context, right? So there's a number of key trends that are really kind of driving what's happening today. As Chiki mentioned, some of the research we're going to get to today is based off of our Axios Harris poll, our Q study, which we've been running for over 20 years. But we've also been running a COVID tracker every week for the last 30 weeks or so since mid-March, right? So all the research that I'm showing you is basically a public resource. This is all freely available information. The key thing that we're doing in today's discussion is really curating it and focusing it for the conference board community. So as we think of the starting point for looking at context today, the core thing is really just understanding the level of fear and distraction that are permeating society, right? So if we go back to mid-March on the far left-hand side of this slide, the key number to be thinking about is that the majority of the population thought that national fear was irrational, as it pertains to COVID. As we go to the far right hand of the screen, what we see today is that 71% say that national fear is sensible, right? So it's a very stark contrast. And as we kind of go a little bit under the hood, these are not small levels of fear, right? These are fears of a new wave, 76% today. Fear of leaving home for essential errands, that's 74%. And then in the middle, these two trends, which are, again, particularly stark and intertwined, and issues we're going to touch on. That being the fear of losing your job, being at 49% today, which is basically on par with fear of dying, which is at 52%, right? These are not small trends, and they're ones that have been pretty consistent, right? So again, you can see mid-March into May, them accelerating, now just holding at kind of like a steady state. And as thinking of it from a marketing communications perspective, just really know that these are the main things that are driving people today. Like that is what they're feeling as they get up in the morning before they start thinking about what they're going to do, and before they start thinking about your company and your brand.
And obviously this is driven by a pandemic that has no end, a world economic collapse that has been just unprecedented. I mean, look at the fear of dying was 27% before, now it's up to, that is a remarkable stat.
It's stark, right? And what you'll see as we go through the presentation, we're going to be looking at both where, where is the fear, but also where is the optimism. And again, just building on really kind of the trend that Chiki was alluding to, and what we've seen, fear of dying, fear of losing your job. One of the key trends to really understand here is the economic inequality, right? The economic impact, right? So there's two really important facets here. As we look across the whole population, the majority of Americans, whether they're high or low income, right, would actually say the economic impact of the pandemic is even a bigger factor than COVID itself, right? So that in itself is a very important trend. But as we break that down between households that are less than $50,000 a year, and then on the other end, looking at households that are over $100,000 a year, that becomes even more stark, right? With the higher income households, you're pretty close to 50-50. Again, more economic versus COVID itself. But when you go to the household income under $50,000 a year, you're almost at 2/3 in terms of looking at the economic impact versus more of the pandemic and the health impact itself.
Yep.
So a very kind of stark reality.
Yep.
So as we're getting further into the headspace that the public is in today, right, one of the things you'll see that we're going to keep on pulling on these threads that give us a sense of optimism. And this is, again, what we're going to see as we get into companies and industries. So because beneath a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the fear, there's also some really, really positive trends that are emerging as well, right? Trends around thankfulness, compassion, and gratitude in addition to the anxiety, right? The top three lines, and again, I know in the presentation these get a little bit small. You all have access to the deck directly, so you'll be able to see it. The top three trends at over 65% are around feeling appreciative, feeling thankful, and feeling compassionate, right? Those are actually the overriding emotions in addition to the very real and the very resonant, anger, cabin fever, loneliness, fear, being overwhelmed, claustrophobic, right? So we really need to be thinking about those things in balance. So as we wake up, we have a lot of anxiety, stress, and fear, but in many cases, you're also surrounded by your family in different ways that you may have not been before, which many people are actually quite thankful for, right? So there's a mix of emotions, a lot of fear, but also some areas of optimism.
And this isn't so much a matter of frequency, but about intensity, right? This is about, this is more about frequency than intensity, right? The percentage of the public who feel this way. Is that right?
Exactly correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. It's kind of an ongoing read of, how are you feeling today, right? And how has that changed over time?
Yeah.
And is this, so I wonder if with the election coming up in 6 weeks, you expect this to change dramatically or not? Because that'll add an extra layer, I think, of anxiety, no?
Yeah, I mean, so the whole area of anxiety is I'm going to keep on referring to other public research we do, I guess. We do a lot of work with the APA. We run their annual study on stress and anxiety, right? Everything that is happening in politics today is a heavy source of anxiety, very close to tied to people kind of what they're reading in the news and what they're seeing on social media, right? So that, what you're talking about around the election is not an insignificant factor. So I think take that for what it is. And by the way, to be clear, that's a very consistent trend depending on, irrespective of what kind of party or philosophical affiliation you have.
Of course.
Right? So being very clear on that.
Rob, so one of the questions that's coming in is about how we reconcile the levels of fear and optimism with people not wearing masks versus those who are insisting on going out in public without masks. Are you able to speak to that at all about?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have layers of research on all of this. So right. In terms of mask wearing, most people would self-report that they're actually following guidelines pretty strongly, right? Okay. So again, I mean, I think a lot of what people see visibly on social media and the news is certainly factual, but may in people's minds be overrepresented.
Okay.
Right. So again, I mean, I think I would also get people to think about, the environment that they're in. Like I would start with that, when you're going at, I mean, I think there are certain geographies where there's a much more stark contrast and many where it's really not, right? And I would just think about, the environments that you and your families are in personally and thinking about the degree to which you see masks or not as being kind of good telltales. Because the general sense, again, you have, there's clear, pretty consistent support for saying, masks are important to wear, they're an important guideline to follow. Most people would also say that, over 70% would say they're following general guidelines. So I don't think it's again, what you see in the media might be different than what the experience on, in your daily life might be.
Let's move on because we've got lots of slides to cover here.
We do. So as we're talking about trends, right? So we've touched on the health and fear, we've touched on the economic, and I'm really hitting these at a high level. These are all areas in future conversations that we go into a lot more depth. One of the most important right now is also in racial equality. And the data that I'm really going to focus on in the racial equality conversation is the fact that it really feels like there's a lot of progress that's been made based on what the data is telling us. This is less my personal opinion. So again, being the Harris poll, we have data that goes back to 1969. So as we're looking at these different demographic groups, the general public versus white versus black Americans, right? The beige is 1969, the orange is 1972, the blue is 2014, and the green is 2020. The key trend that we want to look at here is as we go back to 1969 and we look at white versus black Americans, only 19% of white Americans would say that there is clear discrimination towards black Americans in the way they're treated by the police, right? Versus at that same time, you'd have 76% of black Americans saying that. So really, a 57% gap, massive, right? Versus where we are today, you have a much more of an equalization. There's a more kind of shared perspective on what the reality is, and therefore how directly it needs to be addressed, right? So if we're looking at 2020, the gap is only 15%, right? So a big shift of over 40% in terms of congruence between perspectives, right?
Yep.
In addition to that, as we just directly asked the public, to what degree do you believe that the racial equality movement feels different than it has in the past? What you see is 75% say it has, right? So you get, again, this very clear perspective on a sense of optimism, right? And that's very consistent across the board. The 75% doesn't really wane very much depending on different demographic groups. Slight differences if you're a GOP voter versus Democratic, but very, very consistent across the board, right?
Yeah, great.
And the one kind of additional trend we're going to hit on there, right, in terms of key trends that we're going to touch on as they pertain specifically to companies, is the employment perspective, right? So half of employed Americans say their workplace has made meaningful efforts to acknowledge and address racial inequality. This is especially true with white Americans and young Americans, less so with black Americans, okay? So very strong consistency on kind of the social reality we're dealing with, and in general, pretty, again, strong kind of pull as we look at, that getting pulled into the workplace, but a gap between black and white Americans, with blacks only at black Americans being at 43% versus white Americans being at 56%. So basically, you can see there is a lot of movement that's happening at employers, but it still is quite a different reality if you're a white American versus a black American.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
So with those setups, let's get into some of the company-specific trends, right? And we're going to give you, so as we have the conversation, we're going to keep on funneling narrow and narrower. We started with the broader context. Now we're going to go into industries. Then we're going to go into specific companies and talk about a number of cases which we feel are very good to learn from in terms of today's reality. Right? So we're actually going to start with companies as part of the solution and really a cross-industry tide that we've seen rising. Okay? So again, we have data that goes back most of the last 2 decades. What we're highlighting here for you is industry reputation since 2007 through July 2020. I actually have literally today fresh data that looks at September 2020, so I can speak to that with a few anecdotes. But the trend has been quite consistent, right? Especially as we compare to, where we were in 2007, 2008, and actually in particular 2009. When we saw the financial crisis hit, many industries, especially financial services and automotive, right, took massive hits. But across the board, business was seen as more of the villain than the hero, right? Versus where we are today, and moving from 2000, and most of these time periods are early in the year, January, February, just for context, okay? So as we look at 2019 January versus 2020 January, right, it's pretty flat. From January through to July, you can see some clear acceleration across most industries, right? The pharma industry has actually had one of the biggest boosts. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail with the hope that it actually may spur some creative ideas in terms of how collaboration across industries can look like. But in general, again, business is seen as part of the solution today, right? That's a very important trend for us to be thinking about as communicators, as marketers, and really as business leaders at our organizations, right? And really putting us in that problem-solving mentality.
Right, and to a great extent, this is due to the fact that there's this external pandemic, right? That was really, not, and that it's affecting everybody, right? So everybody's looking for solutions, right?
Yeah. And so that what you hit is a key trend, Chiki, because it's a lot of people ask us, oh, this is all just because of COVID, and you're like, COVID is in the environment. As we'll talk about, the companies that are really succeeding, they're the ones who are bringing their ambitions, their purpose, and their vision to life through action, right? The companies and businesses that are resonating today, it's because they're acting differently and really being able to show their value versus just because of COVID, reputation goes.
They're delivering on their promise, on their purpose-driven communications, and this makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay. So the pharma industry is one of the ones that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because there really is a good case here, right? So we're kind of digging in here and asking, what's your change in opinion about the pharma industry since the beginning of COVID-19? So going much more micro and really being able to look at things on more of a week-to-week basis. And in general, what the core trend we've seen very consistently week over week, it's 2-to-1 more favorable versus more negative. And again, this is an industry, based on the last slide, that has historically been very kind of low. It's been much more in the shadows and generally much more maligned than it is favored, right?
Yeah.
And
this
while
will be something, many of my members will be very happy to see this because we have a lot of pharma companies.
Well,
but this is great.
So many of you have seen this research maybe in one shape or form. I mean, we've done a lot of work with Fierce Pharma, with MMM, and more recently with Stat News. So there's a lot of data out there. Here, again, it's a very tight package. And very important to note, there's really a lot of resonance around the industry. 50% would say that they've seen news coverage, 33% social media, 31% TV advertising, 24% social media advertising, right? And when we look across these channels, they're all highly resonant, right? And there's two trends here. One is, I think that in parallel, I don't know if you can call causation, but it's pretty close. Much of the advertising has shifted from product-specific DTC to, at the very least, adding a much more corporate, broader societal impact story, or completely shifted in that direction, right?
Right.
Again, some of the most resonant campaigns over periods of time, if you look at some of like Pfizer, Science Will Win was a very resonant one, an example. We'll also get into some very specific announcements. But the industry is resonant, and again, from being in the shadows, it is much more front of mind for people, more so than we've ever seen. As we look at the reasons for that, right, so we've actually gotten to a lot of details. Most of you won't be able to read this right now. You will see it on the slides when you guys download. When we look at the top reasons, they're very intuitive, right? It's response to the pandemic. It's developing the coronavirus vaccine and treatment, okay? When we get into the second tier, this is where a lot of the inertia has come from. And again, I'll speak to a little bit of what we're seeing today as a really good manifestation of it. Right in the middle, the piece that's actually very unique and we've seen having a lot of pull is greater collaboration across pharmaceutical companies to expedite treatment and development of COVID-19. Right? This idea of collaboration has been a highly resonant one with the public, and one that the industry has been able to bring to bear. It's a very simple way, and it's a very simple story to say we're not just self-serving, and there's actually a bigger goal we're after here, right? Without saying those words, right? We're a problem solver, right?
Right, and we'll see when we have a vaccine how they price it, or if they give some away for free. I mean, I think that'll be another part of the interesting part of this conversation, right?
It's a very interesting part of the conversation, and we'll even share some data that we think will take you down that path, right? So,
great.
As you then kind of take it a layer deeper, we've actually seen remarkably high resonance around a number of announcements, some of which have directly touched on pricing, right? So this is actually important. Again, as we look at a lot of these announcements, the way that the public has interpreted them is we're making progress on solving a problem, right? And we're actually being quite transparent about it. Two things that historically are very difficult for the pharma industry to push forward. So as there's three announcements that we've looked at. Pfizer announcing the U.S. government COVID vaccine deal is basically $2 billion, but $10 a dose. Right, which Americans could really get their head around it. 65% said they heard it. 31% of those, which is remarkably high, actually recalled details. And of the people that have heard about it, 52% would say they feel more positive about the company, about Pfizer. Right. We also looked at Moderna at the time going into phase 3 clinical trials. As many of you may know, today J&J just announced that they're going into phase 3. And then the last one that we looked at was around Gilead and its announcement of pricing of its core treatment for kind of, basically people that are in dire straits around COVID. And even that one, that from an insider perspective was much more contentious, right? From a public perspective, really resonated as, again, there's a solution available. We're getting the information out versus it being a big issue, if you will, right? Where again, the percent positive is slightly lower, but still in remarkably high territory. Also very important to note, with each of these announcements, the industry itself actually gets a lot of pull, right? So very much kind of like a problem-solving perspective. Okay? The additional thing that a bit of insider info for everybody on today's call, the most recent thing that we looked at was the vaccine pledge, which many of you may have seen early last week, where basically the 9 pharma companies that are far along in the vaccine process had said they will not put it into FDA approval unless it's gone through strict clinical trial guidelines. So we don't have the research on here, but that actually had even higher recall and even higher positive impact, right? And a really, really important trend, because as we look at the industries, one of the things we can see is reputation waning across many, but really staying very, very strong for pharma. So again, I think it's a really important story for pharma, but there's a really important story to be thinking about. What are the key issues that our industry is facing, and is there a way for us to bring forward solutions to those problems at the industry level? That is something that is very resonant with the public if we're providing solutions. It can't feel self-serving.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So now getting into companies as part of the solution, right? We know the context. It's around COVID. It's around income inequality. It's around racial issues, right? There's a lot there. And we also know that employees are kind of a cornerstone. So what can we learn, right? As we look at the company-specific perspective we're working in today, there's a lot of agreement about the value of companies, right? So 81% of Americans agree that large companies with infrastructure and resources are even more vital now to America's future than before the pandemic, right? In many cases, corporate America is actually seen even more trustworthy than the government, right? So trust companies more than the federal government, see companies as more reliable than the federal government in keeping America running, right? Very, very high agreement. In addition to that, there's a broader aperture of expectations, right? Companies around company vision, responding to specific issues, really showing how they think and what they do. There's also a very high level of forgiveness, right, or perceived forgiveness, right? This doesn't mean that you should be doing something crazy and off the charts, but it certainly does. Most of the data, and actually most of the cases we've seen, is as companies have stepped into the fray in constructive and very solution-focused ways, there's a lot of resonance around that. Right?
So, Rob, I know this is from your COVID-19 tracker, so that's within this year. But what's the sense? Do you have a sense of how that would have compared to the crisis of 2009?
It would have been
crash then.
Maybe 50-50 or inverted, right? I mean, that's
okay.
There's a very different lens that people have on companies. We're now kind of 2 generations later, if you will. If we look at millennials and Gen Z, there's a very different set of expectations, right? So I think that, the companies they're in a bit of a sweet spot, but expectations have never been higher, right?
But it does harken a little bit, maybe not, to the times when, right, the Carnegies and many of these big business leaders helped America go through difficult times back in the turn,
Oh, sorry, I missed your context. I thought you were talking about during the financial crisis.
No, I did say that, but this could be related to that, no, right? The feeling of.
I think we're at a very interesting time. If we're going back, call it 50 years, right? The role of companies was very different. If you think of the role of Kodak in Rochester, right? The role of General Motors in Detroit, right? These weren't.
Sure.
It was. Alan Murray, I think, has talked about this much more eloquently than I can, so that you can look up a lot of his thoughts on stakeholder capitalism, right? But the role that companies played at one time as it pertained to communities, they were kind of the lifeblood of it, so they were very central and very core. That has changed as globalization and a variety of other trends swept through in the 70s and 80s, right? So we now have this resurgence of something around stakeholder capitalism, calling that, it's different though, right? It's not going to be the same thing.
But it's an opportunity.
It's a huge opportunity.
Regain that respect that, big companies. Anyhow, I don't mean to dwell.
Yeah.
This is super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And in general, right, again, none of these numbers are that small. Like as we look at, how much do you feel, about large companies responding to, and to what degree do you think they're on the right track? Companies in general on the COVID-19 pandemic, on economic security of their workforce, on racial justice in the country. right? You're just about at 50% of Americans agreeing here. And some of these things are very complex, not kind of easy silver bullet answers, right? You're seeing the majority, especially in COVID-19 response, this is where there's a lot of resonance, right? And a very good setup for kind of the companies that we're really seeing standing. In addition, this is probably one of the most important items to really think about, right? This is not an answer, but this is something that every company today really needs to consider. This is really the idea of the optics of indifference, right? And what that means is when the public doesn't hear you talking about something and you stay silent, there's increasingly negatives associated with doing nothing, right? We can see a variety of very positive attributes, that can emerge if we do speak out, but increasingly, if we do nothing, right? If we again, for many companies, if we kind of fall back on our historical humility and our actions kind of speaking for us, it can actually be a big problem. This is a new reality, right? So 53.
But this is a fine line, right? I mean, I've heard so many of our members say, like, where do you draw the line? How far do you go? What do you say?
That's
How do you say it?
And so we'll show some examples, right? I mean, again, there's no silver bullet answer. We're going to touch on things like racial equality. It is a very complex and extraordinarily sensitive issue, right? But again, if we put on our hats and the frame of mind is we are here to solve a problem, right? We're not trying to kind of reposition ourselves. We're trying to solve a problem, right? And we can make a lot of
the audience here. Rob, who's the audience here? Is this consumers? Is this the general public?
Yeah. So
okay.
It's actually one of the key themes we've looked at through the COVID tracker.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been tracking this with employees and have some really interesting data that some employees are pushing their companies more, and some companies really don't know how to deal with it. But we published something last year, and now we're doing a new one with COVID, so it'll be very interesting to see how they react to social activism by the company, right?
It's very interesting. So this is obviously the conference board is on trend, right? So this is, we've seen the groundswell behind much of this, especially as we're going back 2 or 3 years, is absolutely coming from employees, right? Now we're really seeing it manifest itself extraordinarily clearly in the public, right, in a much broader kind of sphere. So, but it's, again, ECP is on trend. What can I say? We're here to add a little bit of value, but
yeah.
There you go. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So again, if we stay silent, we can be seen as indifferent to the overall society, lacking integrity, being out of touch with what's happening in the world, and lacking compassion and empathy, right? These are much more nefarious underlying versus explicit, right? But really, really important. It's a different kind of strategy. It's really, and it doesn't mean you have to be the leader on every issue, but it certainly means that people have to be able to connect you with things that matter and connect with your company, right? So places where you have heritage, issues that are particularly of particular importance to both your employees and customers, right, are two very key kind of like lenses to put on it.
Yep.
Okay. So we're going to get into specific companies. So the study that we're using to talk about companies is our 21st annual reputation quotient study. For the last couple of years, it's been released with Axios as the Axios Harris 100. It's a very unique study in that it's been around for this long. There's no other kind of stakeholder-based study that's been around this long. It's also a two-phase approach. We don't pick the companies, right? We actually go through a very exhaustive process with the public to see, which companies are really most salient reputationally today. And then we score those companies. And I'll show you the scoring framework so everyone's really clear on what the ingredients that are going in. This year is also very unique in that it's usually fielded early in the year, January, February, which this year would have been a release late March. And again, beyond, it would not have made sense for obvious reasons, right? It's just completely out of context. As we now look at that January data, based on the fielding we did in July, the data is actually very helpful and makes a lot of sense. But at the time, it was just craziness, right? Really not helpful in helping anybody, in guiding anyone forward. So for that reason, we refielded it in late June, early July, really early July. We'll show you those 100 companies. But Also being clear, right? We have a lot of companies in the background across a variety of industries. They're all listed here. You'll have them. And this is all information that we're happy to share freely with the TCB community as it makes sense. So as we look at reputation through the RQ framework, this is the core formula for reputation today. This is not kind of our put our finger up in the air and hope it sticks. This is actually a framework that we've been tuning and we always refine analytically over time, right? So this formula looks different. It's actually trendable and trackable based on the attributes we have, but has had some changes, and I'll highlight those. The big thing is, as we think of reputation today, as we see it building, there's on the right-hand side in blue, these are the more foundational business pieces. There you can think of it as the more traditional components of reputation, right? This is where we look at company vision, company growth, and products and services, right? Both in terms of quality and innovativeness. On the left-hand side, these are more of the new and emergent areas of reputation, right? And actually the places where you increasingly see differentiation, okay? And here we're looking at culture, ethics, and citizenship with a very specific formula around citizenship, right? There's actually a variety of other criteria we have in the back of the study that we can talk about, but these are the two kind of most pertinent ideas today. It doesn't mean that the environment is not important, right? We know it is, and it's actually heavily intertwined with lots of social issues. A lot of our research indicates that the one feeds the other and the other feeds the other, right? But when we think of the shorthand of what's really driving and differentiating on citizenship, it's around sharing my values, which is a very new idea in reputation, right? You won't see it in many frameworks, and you certainly won't see it in much kind of core kind of like construct, if you will. And the second is around supporting good causes, which really is a good frame for thinking about the most important issues with the most important constituencies with the most important communities. The last piece is around trust. This is the stickiness, the glue that kind of holds everything together. So as we bring all of those together, as you see the scores, that creates an RQ score. Each one of them is equally weighted. Okay?
Okay.
Perfect.
And now, ta-da, the list.
What does that mean today? As we look at July 2020, there's a number of different companies that are and organizations that are popping that wouldn't have been on here in January, right? And a number of them are very noteworthy, right? So that's, the Clorox company popped for extraordinarily apparent and obvious reasons, and actually came in at number
General
one.
Mills.
Right? It's a company we've looked at over time and has consistently had a strong reputation, but it wasn't nearly as salient as it is today, right? When we put that framework on being very kind of solution-oriented and delivering for people day to day and day out, Clorox obviously is a brand and a company that stands for that. General Mills has been a company that has been in and out, has actually over the last 20 years has mostly been in the most visible 100 companies, right? But actually for the last 2 years has been off. This year came back onto the radars of Americans. Again, very much a delivering to your family day in, day out. I'm not going to go through all the yellows in detail, but you can see there's a number of different, very unique kinds of companies which, again, historically don't pop. DoorDash, Instacart, Peloton, Zoom Video, Grubhub, and then a number of the sports leagues actually also popped. Major League Baseball, NFL, and the NBA. I'll also note that Pfizer is one of the companies that's back on the list. It's the first pure play pharmaceutical company to be on the list for the last decade. Right? Again, the industry just being much more salient. And again, the industry is on the rise. Pfizer's coming in at 73. That's a good reputation. They're not number one, but they are also, and this is again important to note, we qualify companies based off of salience. We then score them. So the companies up here in blue are really strong. The companies down here in orange and red are quite challenged. Right? So it's not just a best of 100, it's the most salient 100. Right? This gives you a very good lens into kind of what's pulling on reputation, both positively and maybe in some cases not nearly as positively. Okay?
Yeah. Interesting list of companies on the red side over there, but we don't have time to get into that.
No, I mean the one highlight that I'll make in the orange is social media, right? And this is the reason that I make it for this audience is so much of our work and increasingly our campaigns are being driven through social media, less so Twitter, more so Facebook, but they're very contentious, very polarizing. There's no, again, silver bullet of how do you think about it, but you have to be very cautious as we think about each of these, and their businesses.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
There's 3 companies that we'll highlight for you. I just want to show you where they are. So we purposely chose 3 companies from different industries in different positions reputationally. Hopefully what it does is it gives a lens for each of you on the call to kind of think about what your strategy looks like, where you are, and where do you want to get to. So, and these are 3 companies that, again, in different positions, in different industries, but all have had substantive rises, in some cases from 2019, in many cases during COVID, right? So we're going to highlight PepsiCo, we're going to highlight Target, and we're going to highlight Bank of America, right? We're not just choosing the best of the best. We're choosing companies that have made progress based off of specific and substantive action that hopefully will provide a good framework for learning. Okay?
Great.
So first off, PepsiCo, again, a company, we'll put it into a competitive context. A company that's never had a poor reputation, has always been in the 70s, but as we look at COVID, has had a dramatic leap upwards, right? And some of the companies that have actually had the leap, there's a bunch of stuff that was happening right at the same time as we were kind of fielding the study. Of particular note, they're also kind of working against the trend of the rest of the industry. It's not that every company, Coke or Unilever or Kraft Heinz, that make it in similar categories that just had an immediate bump, right? They had a unique and distinctive bump versus peers. Okay? So, why is that? What does it look like? Right? So first and foremost, one of the things you'll see about companies that have made progress on overall reputation, they've also made progress on what we would call closer to like a purpose profile. So these are a variety of aspects that we also look at within the study. Again, they'll be hard to read based on the screen size, so I'm going to read them for you.
Please do.
Shares my values.
Okay.
Cares about more than just its profits. Speaks out on societal issues that are important to me. Behaves responsibly in communities. Is accountable for its actions. Is relevant in culture today. Right? So again, we're seeing reputation, which shares my values as a common thread. But as we kind of pull apart different kind of concepts, you can see pretty strong pull through here as well. So right? The greens pretty consistently are getting bigger. That's like the main takeaway that each of you could visually see.
And green means, I can't read it, I'm sorry. What does green mean?
Green means describes well, favorable, basically.
And the yellow
right?
or...
Do you agree that PepsiCo shares my values? 28% would say yes. Is relevant in culture today? Now 55% would say yes. Right? These are good numbers, especially as you see these 3 on the right. They're getting very close to 50%. When you have 50% of people saying describes well or favorable, that's a very good position to be in, right? And these are great. Behaves responsibly in communities, accountable for its actions, and is relevant in culture today. But the main kind of kicker here, which is important to note, is around some of the work they've recently started that is a very heavy emphasis on racial equality, right? This is also, for a company like PepsiCo, is a bit of a difficult territory because it's been one of the places where Coca-Cola has historically had quite a bit of strength, right? So from the slide before, one of the things you can see is Coca-Cola was actually relatively flat. Its scores has generally been higher, and this score around racial equality and kind of aspects around that have always been in a higher spot. So what it actually means during COVID, there's a lot of companies that can actually get a lot of rise based on doing new things, right, where they're seen as a problem solver making a substantive investment, right? In many cases, the companies that even have more heritage around certain issues, they may have resonance on it, but the bar is even higher, right? So there's actually a number, go ahead.
In this case, I mean, Pepsi has a tradition, at least the last 5-7 years, they started investing in startups, they started helping entrepreneurs. What I'm trying to get at, this is the next logical step and it's resonating positively, but what if you just try to do something quickly in COVID response? Do you think that works? Or is that seen as more? Again, I think there's right now, what we've seen very directly through campaigns we're involved in, if you are seen as solving a problem and addressing it in a very genuine way with real resources, you will get credit for it, right? In order to be able to fund, and again, when we're talking about big numbers, I mean, we're talking about these classes of companies, numbers like $1 million are a lot of money, but don't really resonate with the public. If we're talking about $500 million or $1 billion, even if it's not of direct cash, we're talking about how we're bringing that to bear, it really resonates. So
but we have to explain what that means, right? What is the net value of that investment? What are we actually doing with that investment, right? So that's where you get pull-through. So there is.
What is there in terms of employee vetting, right? The role and participation in companies' employees in saying what they are or knowing what they are ahead of time versus learning about them through the media like everyone else afterwards?
I mean, I think it's more important than ever to have your pulse on what your employees care about and what they're really passionate about and what moves them, right? So that is a really, really important thing. Based on the work that we do a lot of employee research. I would say during COVID, it's more important than ever, right? There are just so many specific nuances, right? For sure social issues, but what is the reality that your employees are facing living and working at home, right? There's a very large gamut of issues that are very pertinent and very personally relevant to your employees that you really need to have your pulse on in terms of how you're communicating, what kind of support and resources you're providing, how are you changing your business strategy, right? You want to ensure operations continue to move smoothly, right? But it's a different reality for virtually every company, right? I mean, changes to your supply chain, changes to manufacturing.
Okay, so you have 2 more companies that you're going to share with us some insights.
That's right.
Yeah. We're going to move quick. Okay? These are quick cases, right? Hopefully we'll try to catch the idea. There's a lot more depth. But so for a company like Target, again, in a highly competitive area, and again, when we look across this industry, most of it has actually been pretty flat. There's been levels of decline more so than incline. Some interesting anecdotes around Amazon. I will not talk about it. But again, as we look at the period from 2019 through to July 2020, you're seeing substantive and consistent acceleration for Target. There's been a heavy emphasis on employees, and that's going to be the main theme that I'm going to resonate with. So as we talked about Pepsi, it's kind of a key social issue, and as Chiki was saying, it's really kind of elevating what they're doing. With Target, there's been a lot of employee pull-through, and when we look at employee pull-through, this has actually been one of the foundational elements. We'll talk about this in the summary, that has really helped companies. Employees, first and foremost, we have to do right by our employees. The well-being of our employees there's nothing more important today because it's something we can have a substantive impact on. But in addition to that, our employees, their voices, the images of our employees are more resonant with the public than ever before. They are inherently authentic, right? They are inherently relatable. It's a very, very powerful story. Again, if it's a true story, it's supported by our actions, supported by the initiatives, et cetera. So for a company like Target, you can actually see the pull-through, and I'll get to the key kind of story on the next slide, even more so across a variety of this purpose profile, right? And you're seeing really, really big pulls. Again, in many cases, you're seeing 10, 15% acceleration points across almost all these aspects. I'm not going to read them back again. Hopefully that you have a little bit of recall. You will have the slides. You guys can review them in detail.
But what was the catalyst with Target?
There you go.
There you go.
So this is, again, they are of the big retailers. Many had said by the end of the year we're going to be moving minimum wage to $15. They were the first company that said we're not just doing spot bonuses, we're actually changing the minimum wage starting now, starting in July, right? So, and this actually is very close to the timing of the study, but it's very unusual to see this kind of change, right? This, again, being the leader and putting our employees at the forefront was really something that Target could lean into. They have history and heritage here, and you basically had a 20% swap in people who were unsure about rewarding employees fairly and really being in a very low point versus most of the RQ companies to being a lead company, right? What we're highlighting here is they're well above the average of 40%, which is the top quartile of RQ companies. Really, one that's seen as one of the leaders today, which is very hard to do in the retail space.
Yep.
Right. In addition to that, 49% of Americans would say Target's had a strong response relative to employee well-being. This is a standout number as well, also in the top quartile.
Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing and good,
exactly
good for Target.
Right. Last case, we'll move through it quick. And so I just want to make sure we haven't been skipping any questions. We're good?
Right, we're good.
Very good.
No.
Okay.
No, you're mesmerizing the audience.
I was trying to keep them entertained in the background.
You're the CFO and mesmerizer. I'm just the data guy. So B of A, right? B of A, remember that slide. We're not talking about B of A moving from 100 to number 1, right? We're talking about moving from orange to yellow, right? They are certainly one of the companies that was most closely perceptually connected to many of the issues around the financial crisis, right? Has been in a very challenged reputational position, okay? So as we look at kind of a competitive set, right, you can actually see in many cases there's some pretty good upward momentum with some companies, right? But in particular for Bank of America, during COVID, right, really it's this January through May timeframe where you're seeing very resonant pull-through for the organization from a very kind of maligned position, not into a leadership position. We're not arguing that they are now, you know, the most reputable company in the country. There's a lot of people who would still have, I'm sure, some negative connotation, but they have made substantive progress, right? And that's what we'll highlight on the next slide. And that's actually in contrast to other companies like JP Morgan Chase & Co., which is, they've been on one of the sharpest inclines for the last decade we've seen, who have just flatlined right now. Okay?
Interesting.
And a big thing here is, and there are many CEOs in financial services who have actually taken much more of a backseat, if you will, who really haven't been as visible. For Bank of America, and again, I don't know the exact Bank of America strategy. I can show you, I can tell you what the data says. I can show you what the stories say. They had certainly taken a much more forceful leadership position. And it started even kind of in the, you know, pre-COVID, in the January timeframe. You can see, you know, again, that's when you look at the World Economic Forum, Brian Moynihan is kind of he's actually the lead CEO on new ESG measures, right? If you believe in new ESG measures, right, that has to trickle down to your philosophy and your culture, right? If you're taking those things seriously and you're saying, we need to figure this out, you better have a good story to tell, right? You as a company better have the data behind it that says, yes, we're actually doing this, we're following it, right? And during the pandemic, they've taken a much more visible leadership role on many issues, right? Ranging from employees. We're actually highlighting a Barron's story here, which we think is important to do. There's a lot of broader media stories. The fact that the CEO's story to Barron's was about his employees, it's a different frame for kind of thinking about it, right? It wasn't about financial success and progress, right, and how we're cutting costs to make sure that our business is viable. It was about our employees, right? And then the last one, which again we think is, there's other companies that have done things like this. This is the biggest we've seen, right? So what they've done is, and again, it's not just cash. It's a full kind of their contribution to how they're addressing racial equality is $1 billion, right? Which ranges across a gamut of communities, small business, a variety of other aspects. But again, it's a big stake in the ground. And once you say that, you know, it can have resonance. If you're seen as a solution provider, it also says there's a lot of action you need to pull through, right? Again, we're not saying Bank of America is now the reputational leader. We're just showing, you know, they have used a certain formula, which we've actually seen bits and parts of, which we'll highlight in the summary, really resonate. Okay?
Yep.
Remarkable. Great examples, Rob. I think that really is a nice gamut of interesting insights. So let's go ahead. We've got about 5 minutes before the top of the hour.
Yeah. I'll move through these pretty quick. Right? Everyone will have these summaries. Yep. You know, as we look at what we've seen, COVID has raised fears, anxieties, and complex issues to degrees we've never seen before, right? But there are silver linings, right? Don't dwell on just the negative. There are a lot of things that are actually, you know, constructive. I don't want to say positive, right? There is thankfulness, there is gratitude, and there certainly has been progress on social issues in ways that most people agree are different than ever, right? Secondarily, you know, companies and industries have really been seen as part of the solution. At the same time, expectations are never higher. More favorability, but we can't just put up, you know, lean back on our couch and put our feet up, right? It's basically saying, that's great, but now you have to deliver, right? And this is the key implication here is, you know, humility and having our actions speak for us is often not enough, and may actually even work against us, right? Last point, today's reputational leaders and improvers, they're all purpose and vision driven, right? But what's standing out is their ability to showcase that purpose and vision in action. So COVID has created an environment that has enabled many actions to be taken that otherwise would be more complicated, more difficult, or maybe even impossible, right? But again, it's doing right by employees, helping families and communities, and addressing social issues, being a problem solver. Okay? So what are three kind of key takeaways, right? So as we're leaving the room, there's three ideas that we really want you to ponder, three considerations, three takeaways, right? Double down, focus on employees. First in ensuring their well-being. That is the first and most important thing. There's no way to go around that, nor do I think anyone would want to do that, right? But having them as the voice and image of the company really resonates, right? Employees are inherently authentic and relatable. Secondarily, it's about bolstering corporate narrative and actions through company leadership, right? If we have the right narrative and actions, right? Not just the right message, if we're taking the right actions, if we're seen as problem solvers, today company leadership can provide a unique source of differentiation. It's putting a big flag, a big stake in the ground, right? But if we have something to tell, it's going to resonate if we are seen as a problem solver and really committing to it. Third, it's reconsider and refine position on social issues, right? Again, this whole lens of the optics of indifference has raised expectations. There is no silver bullet. There's no one issue that every company needs to address. But it's really around focusing action engagement based on where you have heritage and or where employees and customers have passion.
Okay.
Okay.
What strikes me is, this seems to make a lot of sense, and I know we've all been working really hard to achieve these things, whatever your company is. What about COVID fatigue? Like, how do you keep that up? I mean, because we're in this for the long haul. I mean, we've got another year ahead of us, and so how do you pace that?
Yeah,
I
didn't show you the slide. We have the data today. When we look at a lot of the reputational curves for most industries, they're flattening or even going a little bit down. This is why, Chiki, you are the on-trend person. You can see the fatigue and waning. The one industry that is actually bucking that trend is pharma. And again, I would say that some of the big actions they've taken, like for example, the pledge, they pulled together 9 companies in days. That is near impossible to do, right? It's very highly resonant.
But
there is fatigue. There is fatigue.
Pharma makes sense because they're the key to the vaccine, and that's what it has everybody worried. Back to the beginning, fear of dying, fear of losing my job. But I mean, it's a year or more. We're in this.
And that's what I'm saying. It's a unique and creative solution. There's a lot of companies, and industries that are dealing with people day to day, right? There's no easy solution, but it's around keeping up momentum and keeping going, which is really hard to do. But it's very clear, right? Again, there's a very high expectation that has been set based off of really different and impressive actions that have been taken across industries and companies, right? So sustaining it is not easy, but it really takes a new mindset, in many cases, new operations, which many companies have already been on a path to.
Right. Well, Rob, I can't thank you enough. I do want to wrap this up because we're getting to the top of the hour. Want to remind our audience, thank you for attending, that we have next September 30th, we are going to have a webinar on how COVID-19 is spurring an AI-driven digital experience. And then, of course, in mid-October, we are going to have our AI for Enterprise Marketing seminar. That's October 15th. These are all free to members at a small cost to non-members. And there, if you use the code KN1, you'll save $100 if you're a non-member to join us. I see somebody's typing. If I can get into that, well, maybe not. I want to thank you, Rob. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everybody, for attending. As I mentioned, we're going to do these. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome, Ernesto.
We want to do. We want to do this with Rob every month. We're going to send out a survey to our members to see what topics they might want us to see covered, because Rob can talk about anything, and that's what we love about him. Thank you very much, and we will see you very, very soon. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Chiki. Thank you, Craig. Thank you.